people say, so you think male and female brains are the same? And I say, no, I think every brain is different from every other brain, and that's what we should be looking at. My name's Gina Rippon, and I'm Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Neuroimaging. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I use brain imaging techniques to investigate the relationship between brain activity and human behaviour. Well, I'd always been very fascinated by the brain from a very early age, and wanted to find a way of studying the brain. And this is from when I was very small. I didn't think I really understood what the brain was, but I somehow got hold of the idea that it's quite useful, interesting to study. And it was about the time that there was a big interest in the 1980s, 1990s in what was called sex differences and sex roles, because it coincided with the sort of second wave of feminism. And I use the term sex differences because there wasn't a term gender at the time. It was all assumed to be associated with biology. So I got very interested in, I sort of took, yes, of course there are differences between male and female brains, and let's find a way of, because I was then starting to do some early brain imaging studies, let's find a way of characterising them. And then I found it quite hard to replicate some of this work, and I couldn't find the differences which were being claimed. The brain is the most complicated organ in the human body, and if you want to understand behaviour, then you have to look at the brain while it's active. Initially, we just didn't have the techniques because you could only look at a brain if somebody was dead, for example, and then you could do an autopsy. So you could obviously weigh it and measure it and cut it up and look at it, but what makes the link between brain and behaviour is when the organism is behaving. So obviously you can't do that if they're dead. Brain imaging, the kind of techniques that I use and that people are familiar with, perhaps having had an MRI scan in a hospital or something, or seen an EEG, they really only started producing large bodies of work in the 1990s. So really only in the last 30 years have we been able to take intact living humans and put them in a scanner and look at intact living brains. Interestingly, one of the very first studies was looking at differences between males and females. I think about the third study that was published looked at whether or not men processed language differently from women. And a very small study, I think there were 11, maybe there were 19 men and 19 women, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they gave them 4 different language type tasks. How many words can you think of beginning with the letter S, for example? And they found no differences between males and females in 3 of the tasks, but in one of the tasks, which was a rhyming task, all of the males showed activity in both sides of the brain, whereas half of the females showed activity only in one side of the brain. So, big conclusion, clearly males and females process language differently. And I have to say that study would not get published today. Once neuroimaging emerged, associated with it were these wonderfully compelling images, which got published in the popular press and public media, etc. So you get a very detailed picture of the brain, the inside of the brain, and superimposed on that was bright little coloured blobs of red or blue quite often. And people started using terms like the brain lighting up when somebody was thinking of something in particular. And that sort of got hijacked by lots of self-help books, for example. The most famous one of all is Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And because they were very compelling images, they used a lot of these images, often without explaining what they were actually showing, because they didn't know. And therefore they were sort of used to prove whatever the story was that they were trying to tell. Why men don't cry and women can't read maps. There's lots and lots of books like that. And it wasn't until about 2012, 2014 that the neuroscientists themselves started getting a bit anxious about how their work was being used. So they did sort of out a lot of these books as neurotrash and say, these people don't understand what brain images are showing, and they need to be very careful about how they extrapolate from what they see in these nice coloured images. what we are now doing, and certainly some of the work I'm doing, is saying we need to look at the brain while it's active. We need to actually process the brain activity. We're not looking at the structures. We're saying, where is this activity coming from? What does it look like? There's different frequencies, and they are much more interesting to look at in terms of how people succeed in solving a problem or when they fail in solving a problem, and they're much more informative. So we're starting to look at the brain dynamically, and we're also looking at connections between parts of the brain, either dynamic ones in terms of the signal, or actually in pathways as well. So that's really the breakthrough, I think, that brain imaging has brought. The brain isn't just an amazingly efficient and amazingly complex information processing system, which it is. It's also generating rules. It's looking at the outside world and saying, when you heard that sound, this is what came next, or you saw that sight, this is what came next. Very basic level, but also higher levels like social behaviour. When you were in this situation and you said that was a good result, so you get positive coding. When you're in that situation, didn't go so well, so negative coding. So it's not just receiving information, it's saying, it's making a prediction all the time. So we're being driven around a bit, by a guessing machine. So it demonstrates that the brain is much more dynamic, future focused, but also the importance of what's going on in the outside world. There's not just a kind of internal system which carries on regardless. It's also adjusting all the time. A self-correcting algorithm in current computer speak. What it means is that if we think brains are different, any brain, for whatever reason, we actually need to look at the context in which the brain is functioning. We can't just study the brain in anybody's head and assume it's telling us what we need to know. We need to say, well, how is that functioning in the outside world? Is the person who owns that brain, do they have different experiences? Do they encounter different attitudes? Do they have different expectations of themselves? Because again, these predictions determine how we behave. And so if in the outside world there are messages that whoever you are, you will have these sort of experiences but not those, or you encounter those sort of attitudes, that will change the brain. So if the outside world is gendered, which I think hopefully you will agree, the outside world, particularly in the 21st century, is quite strongly gendered, then that will affect how the brain works, and that's how we get to a gendered brain. I'm very passionate about overcoming the underrepresentation of women in science, and I think it proves a very good case study for consequences, because very early on there was quite clear statements that women couldn't do science because they weren't capable, they had the wrong sort of brain. And then it shifted a bit, not a lot, but a bit, and said, okay, well, women have complementary skills, they're very good at team working, perhaps they're not the lone genius who wins the Nobel Prize, but they're very good at the kind of, housekeeping and science type work. And that still, I think, infiltrates a lot of thinking. At earlier ages, girls as young as 6 think that maths is a boy thing. So they won't do maths, they won't choose to do maths, they won't grow up to be a mathematician. And science has quite a bad reputation with respect to every now and then some male figure stands up and says, Google is wasting its time educating women to be engineers because biologically they're not suited to it. And that's in the 21st century. So that's for me, that's one of the consequences, I think, that there is a genuine belief that there is such a thing as a female brain which gives you certain skills which are not suited for science, and that's something we need to challenge. The really good things is that, of course, if it's something in the outside world, then we can actually do something about it. We have agency, and therefore we can understand the power of gender, if you like, gender bombardment in the outside world. And also understanding what you feel about yourself is not necessarily my brain is like this, it's my brain has been made to be like this. I mean, we know that children, very young children, newborn children, babies, etc., are cognitively inferior to adults, mainly. With respect, they haven't got language, as well as not being able to move around and look after themselves. But we know that they're hugely efficient socially from the moment of birth. So that's an important message, that we look at very young children and make sure we don't limit their potential in a way that stereotypes do.